You know, I've been watching what's happening in the Caribbean, and I keep thinking about something my grandmother used to say. She'd watch the news and shake her head and say, "They're not even trying to hide it anymore." And that's exactly what we're looking at right now. We're watching the most powerful empire in human history realize that it's losing its ability to dictate what happens in its own hemisphere. And you know what the crazy part is? Most Americans have absolutely no idea this is even happening. Let me set the scene for you. It's 2025. Russian warships are operating in Venezuelan waters, not as an isolated incident, not as some temporary military exercise, but as an ongoing presence backed up by sophisticated air defense systems, strategic military cooperation, and increasingly deep economic ties. Meanwhile, the United States is scrambling, sending its own naval forces, imposing sanctions that have crushed Venezuela's economy, and essentially throwing a geopolitical tantrum because it can't get its way. Now, when I say the sanctions have crushed Venezuela's economy, I don't mean that casually. A UN report found that American sanctions reduced Venezuelan government revenues by 99%. I want you to really sit with that number for a moment. 99%. That's not a policy that's struggling to work. That's economic warfare. That's deliberately designed destruction. And here's what really gets me. Ask the average American why we're doing this, and they'll probably tell you it's about fighting drug trafficking or promoting democracy or stopping some authoritarian tyrant. That's what the corporate media tells them. That's the narrative. But if you actually look at the facts, and I mean really look at them, not just accept the official story, it becomes pretty obvious that this has nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with oil, with power, with the fundamental question of who gets to control the world's resources and who benefits from that control. See, this is where I want to start because this is the key to understanding everything happening right now. We need to think about political economy. We need to follow the money. We need to ask who wins and who pays. Because once you start asking those questions, once you start looking at the material interests driving these policies, the official narratives start falling apart pretty quickly. Venezuela sits on top of the world's largest proven oil reserves, the largest on the planet, over 300 billion barrels. That's not hyperbole, that's geological fact. Now imagine you're a major oil corporation or a financial institution in New York or London. Imagine your entire business model is built on access to cheap energy and the ability to extract maximum profits. Now imagine there's a country with more oil than anywhere else on Earth, and for the past 20 years, the government of that country has said, "No, we're going to use this resource for the benefit of our own people. We're going to invest in housing, education, healthcare, and social programs." What would you do? You'd be furious. You'd see that as an existential threat to your profit margins, and that's exactly what happened. American oil companies, American banks, American political interests, they realized they couldn't control Venezuela anymore, and they decided they'd rather destroy it than let it pursue an independent path. But here's where capitalism gets interesting. It's also where the system starts revealing its true nature. Because Washington can't just come out and say, "We want to overthrow your government because we want your oil." That would be too honest. That would be too blatant. So instead, what do? They manufacture narratives. They talk about human rights and democracy and authoritarian regimes. They find or create opposition figures and pump resources into them. They impose sanctions they claim are targeted at the government, but which inevitably crush the entire population. It's this fascinating dance, right? The empire can't be too obvious about what it's doing, but it also can't hide it if you actually pay attention. And that's the thing about imperialism in the 21st century. It's become much more subtle than the old gunboat diplomacy days, but it's fundamentally the same process. Control resources, control markets, extract wealth, maintain dominance. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's an interesting analysis, but what does it have to do with Russian warships? Exactly. That's the crucial question, because the Russian warships aren't there by accident. They're there because the world has fundamentally changed in a way that Washington didn't anticipate and still hasn't fully come to terms with. For almost a century, from the end of World War II through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the United States had something economists call structural power. That's a fancy term for the ability to shape the entire global economic system according to your interests. How did they have this power? Through a system called Bretton Woods, and later through what's called the petrodollar. Let me explain how this worked, because it's crucial to understanding why we're where we are today. After World War II, the victorious powers met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and they essentially decided how the global economy would function. They established the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. They created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both structures controlled by Washington. And here's the key part. Every country on Earth that wanted to participate in international trade, that wanted access to capital, that wanted to develop economically, had to do it in U.S. dollars. Do you understand what that means? It means that the United States could literally print money and the rest of the world had to accept it as payment. French President Charles de Gaulle called this the exorbitant privilege. And he was right. It was exorbitant. It allowed the United States to run massive deficits, to consume far more than it produced, to maintain a lifestyle that it couldn't actually afford. Because everyone else needed dollars to trade, the demand for dollars stayed high. The value of the dollar stayed high, and America got to keep living beyond its means. But here's where the story gets interesting. In 1973, when the Bretton Woods system started to crack, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia made a deal, a secret deal. They called it the petrodollar agreement. Saudi Arabia agreed to sell all its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In exchange, the United States provided security guarantees. And because oil is the most traded commodity in the world, because every country needs energy to keep its economy running, this meant that every nation on the planet had to hold dollars to buy oil. This was genius from a certain perspective. It was a continuation of American structural power by other means. It ensured global demand for U.S. currency. It meant Washington could impose sanctions against countries by simply excluding them from the dollar system. It meant they had this incredible tool of economic coercion. And for 50 years, this system worked perfectly. Countries that stepped out of line got sanctioned. Countries that were cooperative got access to capital and trade. The United States maintained its dominance. American corporations could invest anywhere, extract resources, exploit labor, and export the profits home. American soldiers were stationed around the world. American military bases existed in 100 countries. America was the policeman, the banker, the arbiter of global affairs. But empires, by their nature, tend to get arrogant. They start believing their own propaganda. They start assuming their power is permanent, and they start using their tools of power in increasingly reckless ways. And that's exactly what happened. In 2022, the U.S. and its Western allies decided to wage economic war against Russia. They froze Russian central bank reserves. They kicked Russian banks out of the SWIFT system. They prohibited companies from trading with Russia. The idea was to starve Russia of foreign currency, collapse the economy, and force regime change, or at least force Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. And you know what happened? It didn't work. Russia kept selling oil and gas. Russia accepted payment in yuan from China, in rupees from India, in gold. Russia continued functioning. The economy didn't collapse. And more importantly, every government on the planet watched this and thought, if the United States can do this to Russia, a major nuclear power, they could do it to us. And that's when something fundamental shifted. That's when de-dollarization began in earnest. Countries started looking for alternatives. China and Russia began developing independent payment systems. Countries started trading more with each other and less with the West. The trade between BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, that trade has increased by over 120% since 2014. And here's the kicker. The BRICS nations now represent almost a third of global economic activity. They've surpassed the Group of Seven. The world's 7 richest countries, the historical core of Western dominance, are now smaller economically than an alternative bloc that's explicitly organizing to challenge Western hegemony. You won't see this prominently featured in American mainstream media. You won't hear about it on the evening news. Why? Because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the American empire is in decline. And that's politically unacceptable in Washington. But Venezuela knows, China knows, Russia knows, India knows, and increasingly other countries are realizing it too. Venezuela has been under American sanctions since 2017. They were expanded in 2019. These aren't modest, targeted sanctions designed to pressure a government. These are total economic warfare. They've prohibited Venezuela from selling oil on international markets in dollars. They've frozen Venezuelan assets overseas. They've cut Venezuela off from the global financial system. The result? Venezuela's oil production collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day to less than 800,000. The government's revenues collapsed by over 99%. The currency became worthless. People couldn't buy food. Millions emigrated. It's been an absolute humanitarian disaster. And the official story? It's socialism. It's Maduro's incompetence. Look what happens when you reject free markets. That's the narrative. That's what you hear. But it's also complete nonsense. It's like breaking someone's legs and then mocking them for not being able to run a marathon. It's cruelty dressed up as concern for human rights. I mean, think about it logically. If the United States really cared about human rights and democracy, why isn't Saudi Arabia sanctioned? Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. They execute people. They've got no democratic institutions whatsoever, but they're one of America's closest allies. Why? Because they sell oil in dollars and they do what the U.S. tells them to do. Egypt? Sisi's government has imprisoned tens of thousands of political prisoners, but Egypt gets billions in American military aid every year. Why? Because Egypt is strategically important and cooperative. Israel? They maintain what international human rights organizations have called an apartheid system over millions of Palestinians. But Israel gets more American military aid than any country on the planet. Why? Strategic importance. Cooperation with American interests. But Venezuela, which actually holds elections, which has actual political opposition, which has debate and discussion, Venezuela is the one Washington wants to destroy economically. The hypocrisy is so thick you could cut it with a knife. So where does Russia come in? Venezuela, isolated by American sanctions, starving for international support, turned toward Russia. Russia, looking for ways to counter American power, was more than willing to help. It's not charity. Russia's not a benevolent actor. They're pursuing their own interests. They want to demonstrate that they're a great power. They want to show that the United States can't dictate what happens in every region of the world. They want to participate in the emerging multipolar order where power is distributed, not concentrated in Washington. And that's exactly what's happening. Russian warships in the Caribbean aren't a military threat to the United States. It would be absurd to pretend otherwise. The U.S. Navy is vastly more powerful, but that's not the point. The point is that Russia can do this, and there's nothing Washington can do about it. That's the signal. That's what these warships are saying. They're saying the days when the United States could unilaterally dictate what happens in its own hemisphere have ended. They're saying there are other powers now with the capacity and willingness to intervene. They're saying your hegemony is finished. And frankly, for most people on the planet, that's not bad news. American hegemony wasn't exactly benevolent. It was a period of endless military interventions. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and dozens of covert operations. It was a period of massive economic exploitation, where Western corporations extracted resources and wealth from the global South while leaving poverty and environmental destruction behind. It was a period of growing inequality, where the richest 1% accumulated more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. Now, a multipolar world won't be perfect. It'll have its own contradictions and problems, but at least it offers the possibility that smaller countries will have some autonomy, that multiple centers of power will check each other, that there won't be one nation with absolute power to destroy entire economies with sanctions. For Venezuela specifically, it means they can survive. Not thrive, not flourish, but survive. They can trade with China. They can receive military support from Russia. They can join the BRICS and access financial systems that don't depend on the dollar. Without these alternatives, they'd already be completely destroyed, and Washington would have installed a puppet government by now. But because the world has become multipolar, because there are now real alternatives, Venezuela has some breathing room. And here's what makes this really interesting from a Marxist perspective. The very strategies Washington used to maintain its dominance ended up accelerating its decline. The more aggressively they weaponized the dollar, the more motivated other countries became to create alternatives. The more they imposed sanctions, the more countries sought alliances outside the American system. It's this beautiful contradiction at the heart of capitalism itself. American power was based on control of global financial flows. But that power was always dependent on the rest of the world accepting American dominance. The moment countries realized they didn't have to accept it, the moment they organized alternatives, that power evaporated. You can't maintain hegemony through coercion alone. Eventually, people find ways around it. Think about it this way. What's the use of having the most powerful military in the world if you can't control the financial flows? What's the use of being able to invade countries if you can't prevent them from trading with China and Russia? What's the use of imposing sanctions if countries can just create alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely? These are the questions that are keeping strategists in Washington up at night, because they don't have good answers. The traditional tools of American power aren't working anymore. So what's the response? Double down, obviously. More sanctions, more military pressure, more threats, more attempts to destabilize governments that don't align with American interests. The Trump administration has ordered a massive naval deployment in the Caribbean under the pretense of fighting drug trafficking. But come on, if it were really about drugs, why concentrate so much military power specifically in Venezuelan waters? And here's the funny part, and I do mean funny in an absurdist sense. The United States claims Venezuelan government revenues are down 99% because of socialism and incompetence, but they're also claiming Venezuela is still producing enough drugs to require a massive naval intervention. Which is it? Is the government so weak it can't even collect taxes, or is it running an extensive drug trafficking operation? Both can't be true. The contradiction is glaring, but that's how propaganda works. It doesn't have to be logically consistent. It just has to be repeated enough that people stop thinking critically about it. Now, let me tell you about something really fascinating that's happening that you probably haven't heard about. In September 2025, the Venezuelan National Assembly approved a strategic partnership and cooperation treaty with Russia. This isn't just military cooperation. This is deep structural cooperation. Venezuela and Russia are essentially creating an alternative alliance structure outside of American-dominated systems. And it's not just Venezuela and Russia, it's Venezuela and China, Venezuela and Iran, Venezuela and other countries that are also under American pressure. Because here's another thing about capitalism. When you oppress countries enough, they tend to band together against their oppressor. This is actually classic imperialist behavior. Empires maintain control by keeping subordinate nations divided, playing them off against each other, preventing them from organizing alternative power blocks. But the moment they use coercion too aggressively, the moment they try to totally destroy a country, that country has nothing to lose by allying with other oppressed nations. Suddenly, you get the formation of counterblocks. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the BRICS expansion. Countries are realizing they're stronger together than separately. They're building alternative financial institutions. They're creating alternative payment systems. They're developing independent military capabilities. They're making trade deals outside the dollar system. China and Russia are now trading in their own currencies. The petrodollar agreement expired on June 9, 2024. Saudi Arabia, the key to the entire petrodollar system, can now sell oil in any currency it wants. Euros, yuan, rupees, even rubles if they want. This is a fundamental shift in global economic structure. And what's interesting is that American policymakers see this happening, they understand the implications, but they can't really do anything about it except try to slow it down through more pressure, more sanctions, more military threats. Because the alternative would be to voluntarily accept diminished power, to work toward a more equitable global order, to share influence with other nations. And that's something declining empires almost never do willingly. Throughout history, you see the same pattern. A declining empire faces pressure. Instead of adapting gracefully, instead of accepting diminished status, they become more authoritarian internally and more aggressive externally. They extract even more ruthlessly from their own population to maintain the lifestyle of the elite. They look for foreign scapegoats to blame for domestic problems. They wage wars to try to preserve a system that's unsustainable. We're seeing this happen right now in the United States, the militarization of the border, the increasingly aggressive rhetoric toward China, the threats against Iran, the continued interventions in the Middle East, the economic warfare against Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Russia. It's all part of the same pattern, an empire desperately trying to maintain control while the fundamental forces of history make that increasingly impossible. And here's what I find fascinating. The contradiction becomes more and more visible. American policymakers talk about supporting democracy and human rights as justification for their foreign policy. But when you actually look at who they support, the Saudi monarchy, Sisi in Egypt, Netanyahu in Israel, it becomes clear that democracy and human rights are never actually the priority. The priority is always maintaining American dominance and ensuring that resources and markets are accessible to American corporations. When a government tries to use its own resources for the benefit of its own people instead of foreign corporations, that government gets labeled authoritarian and threatening. When a government opens up to foreign corporate exploitation, that government gets labeled pro-democracy and pro-market. It's almost comical if it weren't so tragic, if it weren't causing so much human suffering, but people in the global South aren't fooled by this anymore. They see very clearly that American rhetoric about democracy and human rights is just cover for economic imperialism. And that recognition is driving the shift toward multipolarity. That's why countries are organizing alternatives. That's why they're looking for allies outside the American system. Venezuela is going to become a crucial test case in this transition. The United States has thrown everything at Venezuela: sanctions, attempted coups, military threats. They've caused immense suffering, but they haven't achieved their objective. They haven't overthrown the government or forced the privatization of oil reserves. And now, with Russian military support, with Chinese economic involvement, with Venezuela as part of the BRICS, overthrowing the Venezuelan government would require a level of military intervention that would be catastrophically risky for the United States. That's actually a really important point. American power was always based partly on the implicit threat of military intervention. Countries knew that if they got too far out of line, American military force could be used against them. But that threat only works when you're absolutely dominant militarily and economically, when your economy is struggling, when your military is overstretched, when you don't have the economic resources to afford another major war. That threat loses its credibility. I mean, the United States would need to wage a war against Russia to successfully overthrow the Venezuelan government at this point. That's not a risk that even the most hawkish policymakers are currently willing to take, at least not openly. It's a bridge too far, even for the most aggressive elements of the American foreign policy establishment. So instead, we get what we're seeing: continued sanctions, continued military threats, continued diplomatic pressure, but no actual escalation to direct military conflict. It's Washington in a bind. It can't get what it wants, but it also can't stop trying. It's like watching someone desperately try to win a game that they've already lost, but refuse to accept. Now, here's what's really important to understand about all of this, and this is where the economic analysis becomes crucial. The system that the United States built after World War II, the system that maintained American dominance, was always dependent on a certain level of material productivity and economic output. The dollar worked as a reserve currency because the United States was producing real value. American technology was the most advanced. American agriculture was the most productive. American manufacturing was dominant. But over the past few decades, that's changed. China has become the world's largest manufacturer. India and other countries are becoming technological leaders. Russian energy production is crucial to global supply chains. The relative economic power of the United States has declined significantly. Now, the United States still has the largest economy in the world in absolute terms. It still has a massive military, but relatively speaking, its power has diminished. And that's the key: relative power. Because global influence isn't about absolute capabilities. It's about the relationship between your capabilities and everyone else's. When you have the only industrial base on the planet, you can dictate terms. When you're one of many industrial powers, you have to negotiate. And that shift is what's driving the entire geopolitical transformation we're witnessing. It's not that Russia is becoming more powerful in absolute terms. Russia's economy is smaller than Texas. It's that Russia has developed alternatives, has found alliances, and has demonstrated that it can resist American dominance. That matters much more than the absolute size of the economy, similarly with China. China is no longer dependent on American markets for its economic survival. It has its own markets, its own supply chains, its own technological capabilities. That fundamental shift means China can negotiate with the United States from a position of strength, not weakness. And every country that realizes this, that realizes it doesn't have to accept American dominance, that there are alternatives, every one of those countries starts making different choices. They trade more with each other. They build alternative institutions. They create new alliance structures. And Washington watches this happening and can only intensify its pressure, which accelerates the process even more. It's this beautiful paradox from a Marxist perspective. The very strategies capitalism uses to maintain dominance contain the seeds of its eventual decline. Imperialism contains its own contradictions. It overextends. It becomes unsustainable. It generates resistance that eventually overwhelms it. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying that a multipolar world will be perfect. I'm not saying that China and Russia are benevolent alternatives to American hegemony. Both are pursuing their own imperial interests. China is engaged in significant economic imperialism, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia. Russia has invaded neighbors. Both are authoritarian in different ways. What I'm saying is that a multipolar world offers the possibility of something better than unipolarity. At least in a multipolar world, smaller countries have options. They can play different powers against each other. They can build alliances that protect their interests. They can develop independently instead of being forced into subordination. Venezuela demonstrates this. If the world were still unipolar, if the United States were still the only superpower, Venezuela would have been destroyed decades ago. There would have been a coup, Washington would have installed a puppet government, and the oil reserves would now be controlled by American corporations. End of story. That was always the historical pattern. But because the world has become multipolar, because China and Russia have developed real capabilities, because there are now genuine alternatives to American dominance, Venezuela has been able to resist. Not easily. It's been incredibly difficult. But they've survived, and that survival itself is a historic shift. For the people of Venezuela, this multipolarity is literally a matter of survival. It means their country hasn't been destroyed. It means they still have a government that nominally serves their interests, however imperfectly. It means they can still exercise some level of self-determination. And that's what infuriates Washington so much. It's not that Venezuela is a threat to American security. A country with 30 million people can't threaten a nation with 330 million people with the largest military in the world. What's threatening is that Venezuela represents an example that it's possible to defy American demands, an example that countries can choose to use their resources for their own people instead of foreign corporations, an example that an alternative path is possible. If Venezuela succeeds, if it can develop outside the American orbit, if it can lift its people out of poverty using its own resources, then other countries might get similar ideas. Brazil might decide its resources belong to Brazilians. Argentina might nationalize its industries. Bolivia, Paraguay, Ecuador, countries throughout Latin America might start thinking, maybe we don't have to accept this arrangement. Maybe we can pursue a different path. And from Washington's perspective, that's absolutely intolerable. Not because of any particular threat these countries pose, but because of what it means for the system itself. If the global South starts exercising genuine autonomy, if countries start using their resources for their own development instead of corporate profit, if the neocolonial system starts breaking down, then the entire foundation of American power is undermined. So the response has been brutal. The sanctions have been designed explicitly to cause maximum suffering to the civilian population in hopes that eventually people will give up and demand a government change. It's psychological warfare. It's collective punishment. It's a war crime, actually, if we're being technically accurate about international law. But international law only applies to countries that lack power. Powerful countries can violate it with impunity. And here's the thing that really demonstrates the desperation of American policy. It's not working. After years of devastating sanctions, after multiple attempted coups, after sustained military pressure, the Venezuelan government is still standing. And now it's integrated into alternative systems: BRICS, Russian alliance, Chinese investment, Iranian cooperation. The original objective of forcing regime change and privatizing the oil industry seems further away than ever. So what happens now? That's the trillion-dollar question. Does the United States escalate further? Does it risk direct military conflict with Russia? Or does it eventually accept the reality of a hemisphere where it can't simply impose its will on every country? Honestly, I think even policymakers in Washington don't know the answer to that question. They're improvising, they're reacting to events, they're trying to maintain a position that becomes more untenable every single day. But they can't admit that. They can't tell the American public, we're losing. The world order we built is collapsing. We're no longer the dominant power. That would be political suicide. So instead, they keep escalating. They keep trying the same strategies that aren't working. They keep imposing more sanctions, making more military threats, trying to find new ways to pressure countries into submission, but the underlying trends continue regardless. The global economy keeps fragmenting. Alternative financial systems keep expanding. Economic power keeps shifting toward Asia and the global South, and countries keep looking for ways to assert their independence and sovereignty. The Russian warships in Venezuelan waters are just the most visible sign of these deeper transformations. They're not the cause of American decline. They're a symptom of it. They're what happens when the unipolar world order collapses. And for us here in the United States, this presents both enormous challenges and genuine opportunities. The challenge is that the economic privilege we've enjoyed for decades is disappearing. We won't be able to maintain our standard of living by printing dollars and having the rest of the world accept them. We won't be able to consume far more than we produce. That era is ending. For many Americans, that will mean a lower standard of living. The real wages of American workers have been stagnant for decades anyway, but in the multipolar world, we'll have to face the reality of actual decline, not just stagnation. That's not going to be easy. It's going to create real hardship and real political instability. But here's the opportunity part. We could use this transition to fundamentally reorganize our economy and society. Instead of desperately trying to maintain an unsustainable empire, we could focus on actually building a society that works for ordinary people. We could take the hundreds of billions we spend on the military and use it for universal health care, free education, renewable energy infrastructure. We could create an economy where wealth is distributed more equitably instead of concentrated in the hands of a few billionaires. We could focus on solving real problems, climate change, poverty, disease, instead of waging endless wars to maintain privileged access to resources, but that would require abandoning the illusions of empire. It would require accepting that we're not the indispensable nation. It would require recognizing that our well-being doesn't depend on the subordination of the rest of the world. And that's a very difficult pill for many Americans to swallow, especially after generations of propaganda about American exceptionalism. But it's necessary if we want to navigate this transition without falling into fascism or catastrophic military conflict, because those are the real alternatives we face. We can adapt gracefully to multipolarity, focus on building a better society at home, and cooperate with other nations on the basis of mutual respect and shared interests. Or we can fight desperately against the inevitable, becoming increasingly authoritarian internally and increasingly aggressive externally until we eventually provoke a crisis that nobody can survive. The Russian warships in the Caribbean are a symbol, but symbols matter. They tell us something about the state of the world. They tell us that the old order is dying and a new one is being born. They tell us that we're at a historical crossroads, and the decisions we make in the next few years, as citizens, as workers, as people with some stake in how the future unfolds, those decisions will matter enormously in determining what kind of world we end up with. So the next time you hear someone on television talking about the threat that Venezuela poses to the United States or about how Russia is undermining our interests in the hemisphere, I want you to ask yourself, whose interests? Not the interests of ordinary working people. Working people want decent jobs, affordable health care, a livable climate, communities where we can build lives with dignity. Those aren't served by economic warfare against Venezuela or military confrontation with Russia in the Caribbean. What's served is the interests of oil corporations that want cheap access to Venezuelan reserves. What's served is the interests of Wall Street banks that profit from dollar dominance. What's served is the interests of defense contractors that make trillions from endless military spending. What's served is the interests of the wealthy who benefit from empire. Our interests are completely different. And until we recognize that, until we organize around our actual interests instead of accepting the nationalism and imperial propaganda, we're going to keep getting dragged into conflicts that only benefit the powerful while ordinary people pay the price. The Venezuelan people are paying the price for American sanctions. American workers are paying the price through military spending that could be health care and education. Russian and Ukrainian workers are paying the price through endless war. Chinese workers are paying the price through authoritarian control and exploitation. Everywhere you look, ordinary people are paying while corporations and governments and military contractors make profits. So what do? We organize. We educate ourselves and each other. We build movements that demand something different. We connect with workers and people in other countries who are facing similar problems. We recognize that our real enemies aren't in Venezuela or Russia or China. Our real enemies are the elites who control our own governments, who wage wars for profit, who destroy the environment for quarterly earnings, who accumulate obscene wealth while billions live in poverty. And here's what gives me hope. Despite everything, despite the most brutal sanctions in decades, despite attempted coups and military threats and political isolation, Venezuela hasn't given up. They haven't surrendered their sovereignty. They haven't privatized their oil. They found ways to survive by building alliances with China, Russia, Iran, and other nations also resisting American dominance. They've maintained their independence. And if they can do that under circumstances of almost unimaginable difficulty, facing the most powerful military force in human history, then surely we here, with far more resources and opportunities, with a much more developed economy and infrastructure, surely we can organize to build something better. The warships will come and go, empires will rise and fall, but the fundamental struggle, the struggle between those who seek to exploit and dominate and those who seek justice and equality, that struggle is eternal. It continues every day in every country, including this one, and that's where we have to focus our energy and attention. Not on the geopolitical theater, not on the flags and the rhetoric, but on the underlying material interests that drive history. Understanding that is the first step toward changing it. So pay attention to what's happening in Venezuela. Understand what it means. But more importantly, understand what's happening here at home. Understand who's exploiting your labor. Understand who's making decisions that affect your life. Understand what alternatives are possible, and then organize for change because the old world is dying. That much is clear. But what comes next, that hasn't been determined yet. That depends on us. That depends on what we do.